Picture this. It's 360 BC in ancient Athens. A philosopher named Plato sits down to write what will become history's most enduring mystery. With his quill, he's about to create a legend so powerful that 200 years later, we're still arguing about whether it's real. But here's the thing that might surprise you. Plato probably never intended for anyone to believe Atlantis was real. So how did a philosophical thought experiment become the holy grail of lost civilization hunters? How did it spawn everything from serious archaeological expeditions to Netflix documentaries to QAnon conspiracy theories? Today, we're going on the ultimate journey through the Atlantis rabbit hole. We'll explore what Plato actually wrote, why ancient Greeks were already calling BS on the story, how Victorian occultists turned it into a spiritual crusade, and why modern science has some very inconvenient truths for Atlantis believers. But we're also going to be fair to the believers. Because buried beneath centuries of wild speculation, there might just be some fascinating kernels of historical truth. So grab your diving gear. We're going deep. Let's start at the beginning. And I mean the actual beginning. Because if you've heard about Atlantis from documentaries, YouTube videos, or conspiracy websites, there's a good chance you've heard a version that has almost nothing to do with what Plato actually wrote. Plato mentions Atlantis in exactly two places. His dialogues, Timaeus and Critias, written around 360 BC. And right off the bat, we need to understand something crucial about these texts. They're not historical documents. They're philosophical dialogues, a literary format Plato used to explore ideas through fictional conversation. In the Timaeus, Plato has his character Critias tell this story. About 9,000 years before Plato's time, so roughly 9,600 BC, there was this incredible island empire called Atlantis. It was located beyond the Pillars of Heracles, what we call the Strait of Gibraltar today. Now, Critias claims he heard this story from his grandfather, who heard it from the Athenian lawgiver Solon, who supposedly learned it from Egyptian priests during his travels. It's like the world's oldest game of telephone, but with more philosophical weight. According to Plato's account, Atlantis was massive, larger than Libya and Asia Minor combined. The capital city was built in concentric circles, a central island surrounded by alternating rings of water and land, connected by bridges and tunnels. The whole thing was supposedly about 50 stadia across, roughly 6 miles. The Atlanteans were initially virtuous and blessed by the gods, particularly Poseidon. They had incredible technology for the time, vast naval power, and ruled over much of the known world. They had hot and cold running water, elaborate palaces, and a sophisticated legal system. Visual transition from golden age to corruption. And here's where the moral of the story kicks in. Over time, the Atlanteans became corrupt, greedy, and warlike. They launched an invasion of the Mediterranean, conquering everyone except for one plucky city-state, Athens. Yes, you heard that right. In Plato's version, ancient Athens, his idealized version of it, was the only civilization brave enough to stand up to the Atlantean Empire. And then, in a single day and night, earthquakes and floods destroyed Atlantis completely, sinking it beneath the waves and leaving behind only muddy shallows that made the Atlantic unnavigable. Now, if you're thinking this sounds less like a historical account and more like a morality tale designed to make Athens look awesome while warning about the dangers of hubris and corruption, well, you're probably onto something. See, the Atlantis story appears in dialogues where Plato is trying to illustrate his ideal state. He'd spent the previous dialogue, The Republic, describing the perfect society. Now he wanted to show that perfect society in action. And what better way than to have it face off against a corrupt superpower. Remember, Plato was writing just decades after Athens had suffered a catastrophic defeat in the Peloponnesian War, largely due to imperial overreach and internal political corruption. The parallels between Atlantis and Athens' recent fall from grace would have been crystal clear to his contemporary readers. But here's where it gets interesting. Even in ancient times, people weren't sure if Plato meant this literally or figuratively.
You might think that ancient people were more gullible, more willing to believe in fantastical stories. But when it comes to Atlantis, you'd be wrong. The debate over whether Plato was being literal or metaphorical started almost immediately. Aristotle, Plato's own student, apparently had a pretty sharp response to the Atlantis story. While the exact quote is disputed, he's often credited with saying something along the lines of, "The man who dreamed up Atlantis also sank it," essentially calling it a philosophical fiction used to make a point. Now, not everyone was skeptical. Crantor, writing a commentary on the Timaeus in the 3rd century BC, seems to have taken the story seriously. Later sources claim he even said Egyptian priests had shown him records that confirmed the Atlantis account. But here's the thing. We only know about Crantor's claims through much later writers, and the details are frustratingly vague. Some ancient geographers and historians, like Strabo and Posidonius, thought there might be some truth to the story. But crucially, none of them provide independent evidence. Every single ancient reference to Atlantis traces back to Plato's dialogues. Perhaps most tellingly, within a generation of Plato's death, we have Theopompus of Chios writing a satirical fantasy called Meropis, a clear parody of the Atlantis story featuring an enormous continent populated by giants with armies of millions. This suggests that at least some of Plato's contemporaries saw Atlantis as fair game for mockery, not reverent historical investigation. Early Christian writers had mixed reactions. Philo of Alexandria mentions Atlantis's destruction as an example of the impermanence of earthly power, suggesting he saw it as a useful moral lesson rather than literal history. Other Christian writers were more skeptical, viewing it as dubious pagan mythology. But here's what's really telling. Despite the ancient world's extensive trade networks, detailed geographical knowledge, and careful historical record-keeping by cultures like the Egyptians and Babylonians, no independent ancient source ever mentions anything resembling Atlantis. The Egyptians, who supposedly told Solon the story in the first place, have left us thousands of texts, inscriptions, and records. Not one mentions Atlantis, a 9,000-year-old global catastrophe, or any of the other events Plato describes. This silence is deafening. For over 1,000 years after the fall of Rome, Atlantis was largely forgotten in Western Europe. But when Renaissance scholars rediscovered Plato's works, they found themselves facing a fascinating question. If Atlantis wasn't real, how did Plato know about lands beyond the Atlantic Ocean centuries before Columbus? The discovery of the Americas in the late 15th century suddenly made Atlantis seem prophetic. Here was Plato, writing about a continent beyond the Atlantic, and now Europeans had actually found one. Surely this proved the ancient Greeks knew more than we'd given them credit for. Sir Francis Bacon leaned into this idea with his 1627 work New Atlantis, which imagined a perfect scientific society somewhere in the Pacific. While Bacon was clearly writing fiction, he was tapping into a growing belief that Plato's Atlantis might have been based on real knowledge of the Americas. 17th century scholars like Athanasius Kircher started producing maps that placed Atlantis in the mid-Atlantic, exactly where Plato said it should be. These weren't just flights of fancy. They represented serious attempts to reconcile ancient texts with new geographical knowledge. The age of exploration had created a mindset where anything seemed possible. Europeans were discovering new continents, new civilizations, new species. In that context, a lost civilization in the Atlantic didn't seem that far-fetched. But the Renaissance also brought more rigorous textual analysis. Scholars began to look more carefully at the structure and context of Plato's dialogues, and many concluded that Atlantis was indeed a philosophical allegory rather than historical fact. By the Enlightenment, most serious scholars had relegated Atlantis to the realm of useful fiction. Voltaire, for instance, saw it as a clever invention designed to criticize political systems. But popular imagination is harder to control than academic opinion. The idea that there might be lost continents out there, waiting to be rediscovered, had taken root. And in the 19th century, that idea would explode into something much bigger. If you want to understand how Atlantis went from an obscure ancient text to a global obsession, you need to meet Ignatius Donnelly. He was a U.S. congressman from Minnesota, a lawyer, and most importantly, for our story, a man with a very big imagination and access to a printing press. In 1882, Donnelly published Atlantis, the Antediluvian World, and this book changed everything. It became a bestseller, was translated into multiple languages, and basically created the modern Atlantis industry single-handedly. Donnelly's central thesis was revolutionary. Atlantis wasn't just real, it was the mother civilization of all human culture. Every ancient civilization, Egyptian, Mesopotamian, Mayan, Chinese, was founded by survivors of Atlantis, carrying their advanced knowledge to primitive peoples around the world. To support this theory, Donnelly pointed to similarities between cultures that had supposedly never had contact. Similar flood myths, similar architectural techniques, similar agricultural practices, surely these couldn't be coincidences. He also dove deep into linguistics, claiming that similar words in different languages proved they all descended from a common Atlantean tongue. The fact that many languages have similar words for mother or water? Obviously, Atlantean inheritance. Donnelly even connected Atlantis to the Bible, arguing that the destruction of Atlantis was the same event described as Noah's flood. The Garden of Eden? That was in Atlantis too. Now, to modern readers, Donnelly's arguments are pretty obviously flawed. He cherry-picked similarities while ignoring differences, made linguistic connections that don't hold up to scrutiny, and basically started with his conclusion and worked backward to find evidence. But in the 1880s, this stuff was revolutionary. Remember, this was before modern archaeology, before we understood how cultures actually develop and spread, before we had reliable dating methods for ancient sites. The late 19th century was also the height of evolutionary thinking. Darwin had shown that species evolved over time. Maybe human civilization evolved from a single source too? Donnelly's theory seemed to fit the scientific spirit of the age. Unfortunately, Donnelly's ideas also reflected the racial attitudes of his time. The idea that primitive peoples couldn't have developed civilization on their own, that they needed Atlantean colonizers to teach them. This fit perfectly with 19th century ideas about racial hierarchy. Donnelly's success spawned dozens of imitators and elaborators. Suddenly, everyone was finding Atlantis somewhere, in the Mediterranean, in the Pacific, in the Sahara Desert. The basic template was always the same. Find some unexplained ancient site, claim it was built by Atlanteans, point to cultural similarities as proof. But Donnelly's influence went beyond just archaeology and history. His ideas about a lost super-civilization carrying ancient wisdom were about to be picked up by a very different crowd, the occultists and mystics of the late 19th century. And that's where things get really weird.
The late 19th century was a golden age for spiritualism and occultism. People were talking to the dead, exploring psychic phenomena, and generally trying to find meaning in an increasingly scientific world. And into this mystical marketplace stepped Helena Petrovna Blavatsky. Blavatsky was the founder of Theosophy, one of the most influential occult movements of the modern era. And she had some very specific ideas about Atlantis that went way beyond anything Plato had imagined. In her massive 1888 work, The Secret Doctrine, Blavatsky laid out a complete mystical history of humanity. According to her, human evolution didn't just happen on the physical level, it happened on the spiritual level too, through a series of root races. The Atlanteans, in Blavatsky's system, were the fourth root race. They lived roughly 1 million years ago, way earlier than Plato's timeline, and they were giants with psychic powers. We're talking telepathy, levitation, the ability to control natural forces through pure will. But like Plato's Atlanteans, Blavatsky's eventually became corrupt. They used their psychic powers for selfish purposes, fought devastating wars using occult energies, and eventually destroyed themselves in a cataclysm that sank their continent. Now here's where it gets interesting from a historical perspective. Blavatsky claimed her knowledge came from ancient Tibetan masters who had preserved the true history of humanity. She said she had access to ancient texts that recorded these events in detail. Modern scholars have pretty thoroughly debunked these claims. There's no evidence for these mysterious texts or masters. But Blavatsky's ideas were incredibly influential, especially her claim that the Atlanteans were more spiritually advanced than modern humans. Rudolf Steiner, who started out in theosophy before founding his own movement called anthroposophy, developed these ideas further. He placed the destruction of Atlantis around 7,227 BC and claimed that before the catastrophe, Atlantean initiates fled to higher ground, preserving their knowledge for future civilizations. But the most famous psychic Atlantis investigator was Edgar Cayce, the sleeping prophet. Between the 1920s and 1940s, Cayce gave thousands of psychic readings while in trance, and many of them dealt with Atlantis. According to Cayce, Atlantis was incredibly advanced technologically. They had flying machines, powerful energy crystals, and technology that in some ways surpassed our modern capabilities. The civilization went through several destructions, with the final one occurring around 10,000 BC. Cayce also claimed that many of his clients were reincarnated Atlanteans, carrying memories and karma from their past lives. This idea that Atlantean souls are being reborn in the modern world became a cornerstone of New Age thinking about Atlantis. Cayce made specific predictions about Atlantis, claiming that remnants would rise from the sea in the 1960s. When the underwater rock formation known as the Bimini Road was discovered in 1968, Cayce's followers claimed vindication. Of course, geological analysis has shown that the Bimini Road is a natural limestone formation, not an artificial structure, but that hasn't stopped it from becoming a pilgrimage site for Atlantis believers. Unfortunately, the occult Atlantis tradition also had a very dark side. Some early 20th century occultists, particularly in Germany, began connecting Atlantis to ideas about racial superiority. They claimed that the Atlanteans were the ancestors of the Aryan race, and that their destruction had scattered superior bloodlines around the world. These ideas were picked up by Nazi ideologists like Alfred Rosenberg and Heinrich Himmler, who used them to justify their racial theories. This is a perfect example of how seemingly harmless mystical speculation can be twisted to serve terrible purposes. After World War II, the occult Atlantis tradition largely moved away from racial themes and focused more on spiritual evolution and ancient wisdom. Modern New Age movements often portray Atlantis as a spiritually advanced civilization whose knowledge can help us evolve to higher consciousness. But whether we're talking about 19th century theosophy or modern New Age beliefs, there's a common thread: the idea that modern science and archaeology are missing something important, that there are deeper truths that can only be accessed through spiritual insight. Which brings us to a crucial question. What does actual science tell us about Atlantis? If there's one thing that should have put the Atlantis debate to rest, it's the development of modern oceanography and geology. Since the mid-20th century, we've mapped the ocean floors in incredible detail, drilled core samples from the deep sea, and developed a pretty comprehensive understanding of how continents form and move. The theory of plate tectonics, developed in the 1960s, explains how the Earth's surface has changed over millions of years. And here's the thing: Continents don't just sink into the ocean and disappear. The process of continental drift happens over millions of years, not overnight. We've mapped every square mile of the Atlantic Ocean floor. We know where the mid-Atlantic ridge is spreading the ocean wider. We know where the continental shelves drop off into the deep ocean. And we know the geological history of every major formation. Ocean floor sediment cores give us a detailed record of what's happened in the Atlantic over the past several million years. If a continent the size of Libya and Asia Minor had sunk into the Atlantic 11,000 years ago, it would have left unmistakable evidence in these sediment layers. That evidence doesn't exist. Now, Atlantis believers have pointed to places like the Azores as possible remnants of a sunken continent. But geological analysis shows that these volcanic islands have been steadily rising from the ocean floor over millions of years, not sinking into it. We also know a lot about sea level changes during the ice ages. When Plato's Atlantis supposedly existed around 9600 BC, sea levels were actually about 400 feet lower than today, due to water being locked up in glacial ice. This was the end of the last ice age, and sea levels were rising rapidly as ice sheets melted. This doesn't mean there are no lost lands or submerged cities. Underwater archaeologists have found dozens of sites that were above water during the Ice Age but are now submerged. Places like Doggerland, which connected Britain to continental Europe, or the ancient city of Pavlopetri off the coast of Greece. But these real submerged sites are nothing like Plato's Atlantis. They're coastal settlements, or low-lying plains that were gradually flooded as sea levels rose. None of them show evidence of the advanced technology or massive scale that Atlantis supposedly had. Modern archaeology has also given us much better dating methods and a clearer picture of what human civilization was actually like 11,000 years ago. The Atlantis that Plato describes, with its metallurgy, complex architecture, and large-scale agriculture, simply doesn't fit with what we know about human development in the Neolithic period. Around 9,600 BC, most humans were still hunter-gatherers. The first permanent settlements were just beginning to appear, in places like the Fertile Crescent. The wheel hadn't been invented yet. The idea of a civilization with hot and cold running water, massive naval fleets, and sophisticated metallurgy existing at this time is archaeologically implausible. This doesn't mean ancient peoples weren't sophisticated in their own ways. They absolutely were. But the kind of technological civilization Plato describes didn't appear anywhere in the world until several thousand years later. The scientific method demands extraordinary evidence for extraordinary claims. And the claim that there was an advanced technological civilization 11,000 years ago that somehow left no archaeological trace except for Plato's account is about as extraordinary as claims get. But science isn't just about debunking. It's also about exploring possibilities and investigating claims. So what happens when modern researchers actually go looking for Atlantis? If there's one thing that should have put the Atlantis debate to rest, it's the development of modern oceanography and geology. Since the mid-20th century, we've mapped the ocean floors in incredible detail, drilled core samples from the deep sea, and developed a pretty comprehensive understanding of how continents form and move. The theory of plate tectonics, developed in the 1960s, explains how the Earth's surface has changed over millions of years. And here's the thing: continents don't just sink into the ocean and disappear. The process of continental drift happens over millions of years, not overnight. We've mapped every square mile of the Atlantic Ocean floor. We know where the mid-Atlantic ridge is spreading the ocean wider. We know where the continental shelves drop off into the deep ocean, and we know the geological history of every major formation. Ocean floor sediment cores give us a detailed record of what's happened in the Atlantic over the past several million years. If a continent the size of Libya and Asia Minor had sunk into the Atlantic 11,000 years ago, it would have left unmistakable evidence in these sediment layers. That evidence doesn't exist. Now, Atlantis believers have pointed to places like the Azores as possible remnants of a sunken continent. But geological analysis shows that these volcanic islands have been steadily rising from the ocean floor over millions of years, not sinking into it. We also know a lot about sea level changes during the ice ages. When Plato's Atlantis supposedly existed, around 9,600 BC, sea levels were actually about 400 feet lower than today, due to water being locked up in glacial ice. This was the end of the last ice age, and sea levels were rising rapidly as ice sheets melted. This doesn't mean there are no lost lands or submerged cities. Underwater archaeologists have found dozens of sites that were above water during the Ice Age, but are now submerged. Places like Doggerland, which connected Britain to continental Europe, or the ancient city of Pavlopetri off the coast of Greece. But these real submerged sites are nothing like Plato's Atlantis. They're coastal settlements or low-lying plains that were gradually flooded as sea levels rose. None of them show evidence of the advanced technology or massive scale that Atlantis supposedly had. Modern archaeology has also given us much better dating methods and a clearer picture of what human civilization was actually like 11,000 years ago. The Atlantis that Plato describes, with its metallurgy, complex architecture, and large-scale agriculture, simply doesn't fit with what we know about human development in the Neolithic period. Around 9,600 BC, most humans were still hunter-gatherers. The first permanent settlements were just beginning to appear in places like the Fertile Crescent. The wheel hadn't been invented yet. The idea of a civilization with hot and cold running water, massive naval fleets, and sophisticated metallurgy existing at this time is archaeologically implausible. This doesn't mean ancient peoples weren't sophisticated in their own ways. They absolutely were. But the kind of technological civilization Plato describes didn't appear anywhere in the world until several thousand years later. The scientific method demands extraordinary evidence for extraordinary claims. And the claim that there was an advanced technological civilization 11,000 years ago that somehow left no archaeological trace except for Plato's account is about as extraordinary as claims get. But science isn't just about debunking. It's also about exploring possibilities and investigating claims. So what happens when modern researchers actually go looking for Atlantis? Despite the scientific consensus that Plato's Atlantis is fictional, people keep looking for it. And in the age of satellite imagery, underwater robotics, and advanced geological surveys, the search has become more sophisticated than ever. Over the past century, Atlantis has been found in dozens of locations: the Mediterranean, the Caribbean, Antarctica, the North Sea, the Sahara Desert, and even space. Let's look at some of the most popular theories and what science has to say about them. The most academically respectable Atlantis theory connects it to the Minoan civilization on Crete and the volcanic explosion at Santorini around 1600 BC. The Minoans were indeed an advanced Bronze Age civilization with impressive architecture, sophisticated art, and extensive trade networks. The excavation of Akrotiri on Santorini revealed a city preserved in volcanic ash, like a Mediterranean Pompeii. It's a remarkable sight that shows the sophistication of Minoan civilization and the devastating power of the volcanic eruption. There are certainly parallels with Plato's account, an advanced island civilization destroyed by a natural catastrophe in a single day. But there are also major differences. The timeline is off by thousands of years. The location is the Mediterranean rather than the Atlantic, and the scale is much smaller than Plato describes. Most archaeologists see the Minoan connection as interesting but not conclusive. It's possible that memories of the Santorini eruption influenced later Greek stories about catastrophic destruction, but that's very different from saying the Minoans were literally Plato's Atlanteans. A more recent theory places Atlantis in the Sahara Desert, specifically at the Richat structure in Mauritania. This is a spectacular circular geological formation about 40 kilometers across that's clearly visible from space. This theory was popularized by YouTuber Jimmy Corsetti of the Bright Insight channel, who argues that the Richat structure's concentric circles match Plato's description of Atlantis. He also points to evidence that the Sahara was much greener in the past, with rivers and lakes where there's now desert. However, geological analysis shows that the Richat structure is a natural eroded dome formation that's been around for millions of years. There's no evidence of ancient construction or advanced civilization at the site. The concentric circles are created by different types of rock, eroding at different rates, not by human engineering. It's true that the Sahara was greener in the past. Around 10,000 years ago, it had grasslands, rivers, and lakes. But this green Sahara period ended gradually over thousands of years, not in the catastrophic single day that Plato describes. Some theories place Atlantis in Antarctica, arguing that the continent was ice-free 12,000 years ago and hosted an advanced civilization before being flash-frozen by a polar shift or similar catastrophe. But ice core data shows that Antarctica has been covered in ice for millions of years. There was no recent period when the continent was warm enough to support the kind of civilization Plato describes. In 2011, archaeologist Richard Freund led a team searching for Atlantis in the marshlands of southern Spain. Using satellite imagery and ground-penetrating radar, they identified what they claimed were the remains of a city destroyed by a tsunami. However, Spanish scientists quickly disputed these claims. They argued that what Freund's team had found were natural geological formations, not artificial structures. The supposed evidence of tsunami damage could be explained by normal geological processes. This incident highlights a persistent problem in Atlantis research: the tendency for sensational claims to get media attention while subsequent debunking gets ignored. Many Atlantis discoveries follow this pattern: dramatic announcement, media coverage, then quiet scientific refutation. The Bimini Road remains a favorite among Atlantis enthusiasts. This underwater rock formation near the Bahamas consists of large, flat stones arranged in what appears to be straight lines and right angles. But detailed geological study has shown that these are natural limestone formations called beach rock. The regular patterns are created by natural fracturing processes, not human construction. Similar formations exist in many parts of the world. Modern technology has allowed us to explore the ocean depths in unprecedented detail. If there were ruins of a massive civilization on the ocean floor, we would have found them by now. The fact that we haven't is itself significant evidence. The scientific approach to investigating Atlantis claims is straightforward: examine the evidence, test the hypotheses, and subject the results to peer review. So far, no Atlantis theory has survived this process. But that doesn't mean the search is pointless. Even negative results tell us something important about human history and the development of civilization. So if Atlantis isn't real, why are we still talking about it 2,400 years later? What is it about this story that continues to capture human imagination across cultures and centuries? Let's start with what Plato probably intended: a moral allegory about the dangers of hubris and corruption. The Atlantis story follows a classic pattern: a golden age followed by decline and fall due to moral failings. This resonates because it reflects patterns we see throughout history. Real civilizations do rise and fall. The Roman Empire, the classic Maya, the Khmer Empire, Rapa Nui. History is full of societies that reached great heights before declining or collapsing. The specific causes vary, but the pattern is real. In our current era of climate change and environmental degradation, the Atlantis story has new relevance as a warning about civilizations that destroy themselves through their own actions. The image of an advanced society disappearing beneath the waves is uncomfortably appropriate for our time. Psychologically, Atlantis appeals to several deep human needs. There's the appeal of the lost golden age, the idea that somewhere in the past, humans lived better lives than we do now. This is a common theme in mythology worldwide. There's also the appeal of hidden knowledge, the idea that mainstream authorities are missing or suppressing important truths. In an age of increasing specialization and complex institutions, many people feel disconnected from official knowledge and attracted to alternative explanations. The Atlantis phenomenon also reflects genuine excitement about archaeological discovery. We are still uncovering new sites, revising our understanding of ancient civilizations, and solving historical mysteries. The problem comes when legitimate curiosity gets hijacked by pseudoscientific thinking. The Atlantis story is a perfect case study in the importance of critical thinking. It shows how an initially reasonable question, could this ancient story be based on real events, can spiral into increasingly elaborate speculation when proper evidence standards are abandoned. It demonstrates the difference between scientific thinking and confirmation bias. Real archaeology looks for evidence first, then draws conclusions. Atlantis hunting typically starts with the conclusion that Atlantis exists, then looks for evidence to support that predetermined belief. But we shouldn't dismiss the cultural impact of Atlantis entirely. The story has inspired countless works of art, literature, and film. It's given us a shared vocabulary for talking about lost civilizations and environmental catastrophe. From Jules Verne to Aquaman, Atlantis has become a powerful symbol in popular culture. The search for Atlantis has also led to real discoveries. Underwater archaeology as a discipline has been partly driven by the quest to find lost cities beneath the waves. While we haven't found Atlantis, we have found Thonis Heraklion, Pavlopetri, and dozens of other submerged sites that have expanded our understanding of ancient history. The public fascination with Atlantis has helped fund archaeological research and brought attention to the importance of preserving underwater cultural heritage. Even if the specific goal is misguided, the general interest in ancient civilizations has positive effects. Perhaps most importantly, Atlantis serves as an excellent teaching tool for critical thinking and scientific literacy. It's a perfect example of how to evaluate extraordinary claims, distinguish between different types of evidence, and understand the difference between possibility and probability. In the 21st century, Atlantis has become more than just a legend. It's a multimedia industry. From History Channel documentaries to Netflix series to YouTube channels with millions of subscribers, the lost continent has found new life in the digital age. Shows like Ancient Aliens have popularized increasingly exotic Atlantis theories, often involving extraterrestrial intervention. While these shows are entertaining, they've also spread misconceptions about archaeology and ancient history to millions of viewers. Social media algorithms tend to promote content that generates strong emotional reactions, and few topics generate stronger reactions than claims about hidden history or suppressed knowledge. This has created an environment where sensational Atlantis theories can spread rapidly, often faster than factual corrections. YouTube creators have discovered that Atlantis content performs exceptionally well, generating millions of views and substantial ad revenue. This creates financial incentives to produce increasingly dramatic and sensational content, regardless of accuracy. In response, many professional archaeologists and historians have started creating their own content to provide scientifically accurate information. Channels like World of Antiquity and Stefan Milo offer evidence-based perspectives on ancient history and archaeology. The Atlantis industry extends to tourism as well. The Bahamas has built a massive resort called Atlantis, complete with underwater tunnels and aquariums. Santorini markets itself as the real Atlantis to tourists. These commercial applications show how deeply the myth has penetrated popular culture. The book market continues to be flooded with Atlantis titles, from academic analyses to New Age-channeled communications to alternative history bestsellers. The diversity of approaches shows that Atlantis means different things to different audiences. Video games have embraced Atlantis as a setting for everything from strategy games to action adventures. Games like Assassin's Creed Odyssey and BioShock use Atlantean themes to explore questions about utopia, technology, and social organization. This creates an interesting dynamic where the same subject matter is being used for both education and entertainment, often with very different standards for accuracy. The challenge for consumers is learning to distinguish between the two. While we're debunking the fictional Atlantis, it's worth remembering that archaeology has revealed genuinely lost civilizations that are in many ways more remarkable than anything Plato imagined. Take Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, discovered in the 1990s. This site contains massive stone structures built around 11,000 years ago, roughly the same time period as Plato's Atlantis. But unlike the fictional island empire, Göbekli Tepe is real, and it's forced archaeologists to revise their understanding of early human civilization. The site shows evidence of sophisticated astronomical knowledge, complex social organization, and artistic achievement that we didn't know existed in the Neolithic period. It's a genuine game changer for our understanding of early human capabilities. Recent LiDAR surveys of the Amazon rainforest have revealed vast networks of previously unknown settlements, suggesting that the pre-Columbian Amazon supported much larger and more complex societies than previously thought. Underwater archaeologists have discovered dozens of genuinely submerged settlements around the world. Thonis Heraklion in Egypt was a major port city that sank into the Mediterranean. Pavlopetri in Greece is a 5,000-year-old submerged town. These sites show us what real lost cities look like. The Antikythera mechanism, discovered in a Greek shipwreck, is a 2,000-year-old analog computer used to predict astronomical positions. It's so sophisticated that nothing comparable appears in the archaeological record for another 1,000 years. The Indus Valley civilization had sophisticated urban planning, advanced drainage systems, and standardized weights and measures 4,500 years ago. Yet we still can't read their script, making them genuinely mysterious. Rapa Nui, Easter Island, represents a real example of a civilization that may have collapsed due to environmental degradation. The island's famous Moai statues are evidence of a complex society that flourished in one of the most isolated places on Earth. These real lost civilizations share some characteristics with fictional Atlantis. They were more advanced than we initially thought. Some were lost to natural disasters or environmental changes, and they've forced us to revise our understanding of human history. But there's a crucial difference. We know about these civilizations through careful archaeological investigation, not through ancient stories or psychic visions. They're documented through physical evidence that can be studied, tested, and verified. The exciting thing is that we're still making discoveries. New sites are being found every year. New techniques are revealing hidden aspects of known sites, and our understanding of ancient civilizations continues to evolve. Advances in technology, from satellite imagery to ground-penetrating radar to ancient DNA analysis, are giving archaeologists tools that previous generations could never have imagined. We're living in a golden age of archaeological discovery. So while Plato's Atlantis remains fictional, the search for lost civilizations continues through legitimate archaeological research. And what we're finding is often more amazing than fiction. Before we wrap up our journey through the Atlantis rabbit hole, let's examine why this particular myth has such staying power. What psychological needs does belief in Atlantis fulfill? The appeal of a lost golden age taps into what psychologists call rosy retrospection, our tendency to remember the past more positively than we experienced it. Atlantis represents the ultimate rosy retrospection, a perfect civilization that we can never quite reach again. Belief in hidden or suppressed knowledge appeals to our pattern recognition systems, which evolved to help us spot dangers and opportunities. Sometimes these systems fire when there's no real pattern, leading us to see connections that don't exist. In an era of increasing distrust in institutions, alternative theories like Atlantis offer a way to feel smarter than the experts. If mainstream archaeologists are wrong about Atlantis, maybe they're wrong about other things too. There's also a legitimate sense of wonder at play. The world feels increasingly mapped and understood, so the idea that there might still be major mysteries to solve is genuinely exciting. Atlantis represents the promise that there are still discoveries to be made. Belief in Atlantis creates communities of like-minded people who share a sense of special knowledge. Online forums, conferences, and social media groups provide social connections based on these shared interests. For some people, Atlantis provides a sense of meaning and purpose. Searching for the lost continent becomes a quest that gives direction to their lives, whether through research, travel, or spiritual practice. Once someone becomes invested in believing in Atlantis, cognitive dissonance makes it psychologically difficult to abandon that belief. New evidence that contradicts the belief is often reinterpreted or dismissed rather than accepted. Understanding these psychological factors doesn't mean we should dismiss Atlantis believers as foolish. Instead, it suggests that good education should include training in critical thinking, media literacy, and the scientific method. It also suggests that scientists and educators need to be more empathetic to the psychological needs that alternative theories fulfill. Simply debunking isn't enough. We need to provide the wonder, community, and sense of purpose that people are seeking. We've traveled a long way together on this journey through the Atlantis legend. We've explored ancient philosophy, medieval scholarship, Victorian speculation, occult mysticism, modern pseudoscience, and legitimate archaeology. So what have we really found? We've found that Plato created one of history's most enduring thought experiments, a story designed to explore questions about justice, power, and the rise and fall of civilizations. That this fictional story has sparked real exploration and discovery shows the power of great storytelling. We've found that human curiosity is irrepressible. Even when pursuing a fictional goal, people have made real discoveries, developed new technologies, and expanded our understanding of the world. The search for Atlantis has led to advances in underwater archaeology, marine geology, and ancient history. We've found that the ability to think critically about extraordinary claims is more important than ever in our information-saturated age. The Atlantis legend provides a perfect case study in how to evaluate evidence, understand bias, and distinguish between possibility and probability. We've found that the real ancient world is far more amazing than any fiction. From Göbekli Tepe to the Antikythera mechanism to the vast cities hidden under Amazon rainforest, legitimate archaeology continues to surprise us with evidence of human ingenuity and achievement. We've found that while Atlantis itself is fictional, the themes it represents, advanced civilizations, catastrophic destruction, cultural memory of disaster, reflect real aspects of human experience. Flood myths exist worldwide because floods have indeed shaped human history. We've found that Plato's warning about hubris and environmental destruction is more relevant than ever. While we don't need to worry about our continent sinking overnight, we do need to worry about the long-term sustainability of our civilization. Most importantly, we've found that there's still plenty of mystery and wonder in the world without needing to invoke fictional lost continents. Every year brings new archaeological discoveries, new insights into ancient civilizations, and new questions to explore. The real treasure isn't a sunken city full of gold. It's the combination of scientific rigor and human imagination that allows us to explore our past, understand our present, and plan for our future. Atlantis may be fiction, but the human story it represents, the rise and fall of civilizations, the power of knowledge, the importance of wisdom and humility, that story is very real. And it's a story we're still writing. So where does this leave us? If you're fascinated by ancient civilizations, channel that interest into learning about the amazing real discoveries being made every day. Support legitimate archaeology and science education. Visit museums, read peer-reviewed research, and always ask for evidence. If you're drawn to mysteries and unexplained phenomena, remember that the biggest mysteries often hide in plain sight. Why did humans develop language? How did civilization arise independently in different parts of the world? What can ancient cultures teach us about living sustainably? And remember that wonder and skepticism aren't opposites, they're partners. The most wonderful discoveries come from asking hard questions and demanding good evidence. The real Atlantis isn't a lost continent, it's the endless human capacity for curiosity, discovery, and growth. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive into the Atlantis legend. If you enjoyed this exploration of how myths become reality in popular culture, make sure to subscribe for more long-form investigations into history's greatest mysteries. And let me know in the comments, what aspect of the Atlantis story do you find most interesting? The ancient philosophy, the Victorian speculation, the modern searches, or something else entirely? Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and remember, the truth is always more interesting than fiction.